Let's get the show on the road. But a bit of housekeeping before I begin. If any of you in here are AICPs, and if you are, you know what that means. Don't forget to log a CM credit for 1 hour after the lecture is over tonight. Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Ezel, and I am a city planning faculty member. I'm also a Baumer committee member here in the Knowlton School, and I represent planning. And I am so happy tonight to introduce another way planning academics merge their research with community members to make places better. Theo Lim is an associate professor on the faculty of Virginia Tech Urban Affairs and Planning program. Theo specializes in research and teaching in urban environmental and climate adaptation planning, environmental science policy interfaces, and community engagement. Currently, Theo is the principal investigator of several projects funded by the National Science Foundation's Career Program, the NSF Civic Innovation Program, and the National Oceanic and Atmospherics Environmental Literacy Program. Lim also serves on the editorial team of the Journal of Planning Theory and Practice and on a team implementing a phase 2 multi-million-dollar NSF Foundation grant with our other speaker, Antwyne Calloway. Antwyne is currently the president and executive director of NNEO, Inc., an African-American owned and operated nonprofit in Roanoke, Virginia, providing affordable housing options and community development implementation. Prior to this, Antwyne has 20-plus years of experience in planning and planning-related positions and service, such as a city planner for the city of Roanoke, and a key member of Roanoke's study committee to reduce gun violence. Theo and Antwyne present their work. It's not up there anymore. Trauma-induced healing-centered planning, transformation in the face of global climate change. I'm going to fix that for them, but in the meantime, give them a hand.
Thank you, Kyle, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. We're very happy to share our work with you today. The title of our presentation that we'll be giving is Trauma-Informed Healing-Centered Planning, Transformations in the Face of Global Climate Change. To get us started, I'd like to reflect for a moment on how we've been thinking about transformation through some of the projects that you will hear about today. In 1968, Apollo 8 sent astronauts into space on a mission that circled the moon. Many people watched it on television. At a certain point, one of the astronauts on the mission said, "We're going to turn the camera around and show you the Earth." When he did that, that was the first time that many people had ever seen the planet hanging in space like that. Many described it as a profound experience. I'd like to read a quotation from one of these people. They said, "I think that for me, like for many other people, it was quite a shock. I don't think any of us had any expectations about how it would give us a different perspective. I think the focus had been, we're going to the stars, we're going to the planets, and suddenly we look back at ourselves, and it seems to imply a new kind of self-awareness." One of the astronauts said, "When we originally went to the moon, our total focus was on the moon. We weren't thinking about looking back at the Earth, but now that we've done it, that might well have been the most important reason we went." What you'll hear about today is an attempt by Antwyne and me to begin to make sense of some of our experiences we've had in our participatory action research projects in Roanoke, Virginia. While our projects largely focus on how to build community capacity to deal with rising temperatures in the city, it has also been a process of turning the camera on ourselves. It's been a period of intense reflection. Who are we? How do we relate to each other? And why? And so we would like to suggest that the way transformation is occurring is mostly through modeling transformations of ourselves, personally and organizationally. Through our process, trauma-informed healing-centered practice principles have been key to helping us achieve this transformation.
Greetings. Good evening. I greet you in the presence of all of my ancestors, all of my mothers, and all of my fathers. I also greet you in the presence of my community, both my spiritual as well as my lived community. On this day, you see some pictures and images of my master teachers, so I have to honor them as well. On the left, we have John Henry Clark. On the right, we have Dr. Yosef Ben Yakiman. Both have been African-American scholars here located in the United States. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to a young gentleman with a very lively butterfly collar. This is Antwyne Calloway at the age of 4. I was born and raised in Roanoke, Virginia, in Lincoln Terrace housing projects. There I grew up in a community that I felt like was a very vibrant one. I grew up there between the 1975 and the 1980s. And at that time, our community was very unified. We had individuals in our community that provided assistance to each other in the form of babysitting and childcare, in a form of making sure that everyone had something to eat. Even in my community, I remember being young when Christmas was taken care of by other family members, or even my mother helped out to care for other individuals in Christmas. It wasn't until many years later that I started to hear stories about my community and the impacts of my community. But for me, all I had ever known was that my community was one of love and care. And if there was ever anything that would harm me, that it would come from outside of my community, but my community would protect me. It wasn't until around about the mid-'80s where I started to see my community change, where I started to realize that my community was going to be different. At one time, we had a nice, green, beautiful field that we played in. And for some reason, everybody used to acknowledge and call this place the dump. And I never knew why at a young age, around 4, 5, 6, and 7, why this place that we played on was called a dump. But I started hearing late at night stories, and when family members were talking, I would hear people make references of like, yeah, we all might live on a landfill or in a dump, but everybody don't have to act like trash. I even remember one time going to school and hearing a classmate make a remark about, hey, we live on the other side of town, but they bring us over here where you all live in the dump and the trash. I never understood what that meant. And it wasn't until some years later where I started to understand what that meant to me and to my family. Around about the 1980s, that's when our community started to change. That is where I started to witness my elders just become normal people. It was actually the introduction of crack cocaine that happened. And when crack cocaine was introduced to my neighborhood, on top of a lot of environmental issues, my community changed drastically. Before the age of 12, I witnessed my first murder. By the age of 12, I had already seen my second murder. I stood in a playground and I watched as 3 men chased 2 guys right past us, no more than about 50 feet away from us, and then gunned these 2 guys down. And at the same time, one guy turns, looks me directly in my eyes, and then looks down and sends 2 shots down to the man laying on the ground. And he ran and they left. But it was around about the time that my mother started to make a decision that she would have to change where we live because our environment was changing. But I also realized that something more deeper had to be going on in our neighborhood and our community. Right here, I show you Roanoke, Virginia in 1940 on the right. On the right-hand side, you can see the actual African-American community in Roanoke. It was at one time referred to as the Black Wall Street of the East or the South. But that had quickly changed because when urban renewal started, our neighborhood, our community began to change. As you look at the 1995 picture, you can realize that there has been significant change because more than 1,600 homes are missing. 24 churches and congregations. And then at that time, more than 200 businesses were forced to relocate or close. And the most hurtful part of this was that one day, our local officials felt the need to go to an African American cemetery that had been there since the Civil War and exhume the bodies and put them all into dump trucks and take them all the way to the end of the city line and then dump them all in a mass grave. When this happened, and around about the time that this happened is when I really started to learn about the dirty secrets of my community. That's when I really started to learn what urban renewal had done, but not just that. Is that the place that I used to call a grassy field, and I used to actually, in the springtime, you could look up and see balloons, like hot air balloons coming, and they all landed on this field because it was so large. But this place was one time considered a dump in my neighborhood. If you look at the picture that is located on the left-hand side, this is actually the same community. It was an active landfill all the way until 1963. It was residents that lived there that came out their house and said that they could witness soot and all other kind of things just on their house because it wasn't a landfill that is just trash laying there. It was actually burning. It had an incinerator in the middle of my neighborhood and my dump in my community. At that time, my mother made a conscious decision to move us from that community because of the change. Around about 1985, we made the move. My mother moved us to this place called Gilmer Avenue in hopes to escape some of the environmental issues that we were dealing with in the housing projects that we once lived in. But unknown to her that this area right here would soon be considered rock alley or crack alley. And during around about my 13th birthday, I witnessed my cousin first making hand-to-hand sales on this exact corner where you see the stop sign at on the left side. Many days later, I came back, saw him still actively engaged in hand-to-hand sales or distribution. And then I realized, I asked my friend, what is that he's doing? I wonder, what is he doing here? My friend opened his hand and he showed me these 3 white rocks in his hand. I said, well, what is that? He said, it's crack cocaine. What is crack? What is it? He said, that's what your cousin's doing. Watch. And then I instantly see my cousin run to another car. And then he comes back. I said, well, what is he doing? Selling it to him for $25. Well, where'd you get that? That's what I asked him. He said, I got it from your cousin. And I said, well, why would he give it to you and not give it to me? And he said, that's what you'll have to ask. Now, I could say up until that moment, the universe may have had me on a path to be a doctor or a lawyer or something else. But at that moment, I made the conscious decision to become a drug dealer. On the right hand, on the right-hand side, you can actually see one of the places that I first actually started selling drugs at that young age. I'll tell anyone, and I tell most people that I meet, I didn't grow up in a crack house, but I did grow up in a crack house. I may not have, my mother actually never abused any hardcore substances. She might have smoked a little weed here and there, but she really wasn't abusing it. But I never was introduced to a hardcore substance a day in my life. But it wasn't until I began to actively be involved in drug dealing that I learned that life had another path for me. It was there that I learned relationships. It was within the crack house that I learned what conflict resolution was. To many, conflict resolution is a conversation or communication. But for us, conflict resolution was clipping the gun, pull it back, and then go from there. By the age of 14, I found myself incarcerated to the place that you see on the left-hand side. I went and I did juvenile time, and I was facing 37 years. After I did my juvenile time, I still had crack cocaine located on my back porch. So after doing about anywhere between 12 and 15 months, I came straight back home and instantly started selling drugs again. Then once I got incarcerated, I found myself located in Roanoke City Jail, which you see on the right. Below you can see some of my criminal history that is there. So that is a reflection of who I used to be, but not the man that stands before you. I say that because my journey had to take a path and a changing path. Even because I did not understand, I had to come to a place in my journey where The hard things that you endure builds you, adds character to who you are and what you will be many years from now. I remember a conversation with my cousin. This is my cousin Rico Hilton. And one day he asked me, "Hey, cuz," or he used to call me dog. He said, "Hey, dog, you mind if you follow me and drop my car off so I can get it painted?" And I said, "Yeah, that's okay. We can do that." We hung up the phone and he instantly called me back. He said, "Dog, can I chill with you tomorrow? Can I just spend most of the day with you just to see exactly what it is you do?" And I told him I had no problem with that. So the next day I picked him up as he dropped his car off, and my morning routine always was roll up 3 or 4 blunts, get my Bible, get my newspaper, go to the park, sit in the park, read my newspaper and study my Bible, and whatever clientele that I was dealing with on that day would come to the park and meet me at the park, and I would do my business there. Rico sat in the car with me for about 2 hours and was very silent and just watched as I did everything I did. And then he asked me, say, "Hey, cuz, can I talk to you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Why you do what you do?" I said, "Huh?" He said, "Why do you do what you do?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "I read the Bible and I've been studying it for quite some time. And, it says there are stories that may happen when people need to change their lives." I said, "But I've never tried anything different. I've never given anything a try. So I just do what I've been doing, and I hope nothing comes upon me that makes me have to change my life." That was around about July 2021, when I expressed that to Rico. And by December 24th, that evening, a gentleman showed me 2 firearms. By that morning, I gave Rico a hug and told him, watch your back, be careful. And by that evening, I was receiving a phone call telling me that Rico had been shot. When I received the phone call telling me that he had been shot, I instantly start to move in the direction to find out what is it that I need to do to enact whatever form of vengeance is going to happen. So I go to his mother's house. He's not there. Then I go to the store. Somebody says, "Oh, well, he got shot at the store, but he's not at the store." So I said, "Well, where is he?" "Well, he's at the hospital." "They're on their way to the hospital." I get a call. My cousin said, "They got him at the hospital." When I get to the hospital and I park my car and I get out my car, I heard the most unearthly sound I've ever heard a day in my life. It was his mother's scream. It was so full of sorrow. It was so full of hurt. It was so full of pain that it instantly changed my path and it changed my direction. And as I walked Rico's casket to the grave, I consistently said to myself over and over, something has to change. This has to be different. For a month, we engaged in activity that is negative in my community. And it was acts of violence that we looked to engage in and be a part of. But that began to shift and to change in my life. At that present point in time, I began to intern at an organization known as Virginia Cares Incorporated, which is a pre- and post-incarceration service provider. I stayed there for 3 years. After I left from there, I began to be the program manager for the Dorcas Home, which is a halfway house that only accepted long-term and violent offenders. Went on to work with United Way. I also worked with an organization known as Blue Ridge Independent Living Center that showed me how to truly be an advocate, because the disability community really, really has some strong advocacy that they do in our communities. I said it to say that in my journey, in my walk, I realized that this is a dump. What belongs in a dump? As many times as I've crossed that path and drove past that field and looked at that field, I also remember people in my community talking about us living at the dump, being a part of the dump. And all I could think of is, what do you place in the dump? Well, I remember what my community placed in the dump many years ago, when they took and exhumed all the African-American bodies and threw them all the way to the county line and dumped them there. What belongs in the dump is things that have been discarded, unwanted, that people no longer want. Is that what my life was? Is that who I was? Some years ago, there was a story that was written about our city, about our town, and about how urban renewal has impacted our town. It was written by Dr. Mindy Fullilove, and it described, it's named Rushat, but it actually describes the impact of urban renewal on our community.
So I started at Virginia Tech in 2019. My background is actually in environmental science. Roanoke had just done its first urban heat mapping campaign funded through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where they were mapping the differentials in air temperature across the city, which you can see there on the right. And the neighborhood that Antwyne was just talking about here is some of the reddest areas. The red hues correspond to hotter air temperatures in the city, the bluer, cooler air temperatures in the city. The city was wondering what to do as a next step after finding this information out. And so I was trying to figure out, from a background of urban climate adaptation, how can we use this information to make the city and its most vulnerable residents more resilient to the impacts of rising temperatures. I should say Roanoke is located in the Appalachian Mountains, and so compared to the rest of the South, it's a little bit cooler, but projections, if things continue to go as the current trends show, will make that climate much more similar to that of Tuscaloosa, Alabama in the next 50 years. The building stock is not prepared for that. Many people do not have air conditioning, not used to running it, or cannot afford to run it, especially in some of these neighborhoods that are the hottest. We also know that there's no such thing as a natural disaster, right? Disasters follow from inadequate preparation for natural hazards, and that risk is compounded by hazard and exposure and vulnerability. The temperature differences across the city were very stark, 10 to 15 degrees from the hottest areas to some of the cooler areas in the city. As urban planners, we think that there are some approaches that can help mitigate some of those temperatures, like changing the albedo of dark-colored roofs so that more of the energy is reflected back into the atmosphere, or urban greening, or building splash pads so that people can cool off, or preserving urban forests and building more shade. But as we were talking about some of these solutions and how we might use that data that was collected through the NOAA campaign, this was actually one of the first times that Antwyne and I had one of our first conversations. We were holding these community meetings of what to do in Roanoke to make the city more adapted to rising temperatures. And I had noticed that Antwyne had stopped showing up to our community meetings. And so I went to go find him at his office at the Lawson Building, which happens to be located in the historically African-American neighborhood in Roanoke called Gainsboro. What you see on the left there is what Henry Street, which Antwyne just referred to as previously the center of the Black Wall Street of the South, looks like today. Not a lot of people around, a lot of empty lots, weedy fields, parking lots. And I remember Antwyne coming out and pointing outside of his building, rattling off a list of dozens of businesses, names, churches. And I literally was looking at it and I could not see anything there but a weedy lot. And it was at that moment that I realized I literally cannot see what you see in your own community. And I need to learn how to see that. What you see on the right there is a drawing that was done by the artist David Ramey, a longtime resident of Roanoke, from memory of Henry Street. And you can see how vibrant it was, with jazz clubs and theaters, Black-owned businesses and churches. From Antwyne's story, we got to know each other, very well, I would say, after working together very closely. Me really wanting to learn how to see what he sees of his own community. We realized that we needed to broaden what the point of our project was. It wasn't just about adapting urban areas to heat in the way that we think they should, because there is this history of trauma, and urban planning is frankly complicit in a lot of that through urban renewal, which in Roanoke, it went all the way through the 90s, and I was born in 1985. That's not that long ago. It was happening within our lifetimes. So this is fresh in the memory of the residents. So we know from the mental and behavioral health literature, that trauma-informed care, there are some principles that you can follow. So we're going to use these four to kind of structure some of our presentation here. But first, you need to realize what is the widespread nature of trauma. You need to recognize how in any incident, how trauma may be impacting somebody. You need to be able to respond in a way that allows people to be heard. And you need to do things that resist the re-traumatization of the communities that you're working with, including promoting healing. So what does this have to do with planning? There's a lot of literature in planning that has to do with emotions and how we engage emotions in planning processes. There's also literature that says that planning itself, if you do it in a culturally centered and emotionally intelligent way, can itself be therapeutic for people, thinking about the future, planning for the future. However, we also know urban planning is complicit in the causes of some of these intergenerational community traumas. And there are increasingly calls for the need to recognize the institutions of urban planning themselves need to make amends for the harms that they've caused. And that brings us to where we are now, which is trauma-informed and healing-centered urban planning, which others have started to write about with more frequency. So our definition, when we're talking about trauma-informed and healing-centered practice in planning, includes two things. The first is acknowledging the healing effects that the act of emotionally and culturally responsive planning can have with the groups that have experienced these kinds of collective traumas. And then the second half is, what are the actions that are needed to transform the institutions of planning to stop that harm and to make amends for those past harms? So we'll talk about two participatory action research that we've got, projects that we've got going on in Roanoke. The left one is our Hope for Heat Resilience project, which is one that's funded by the National Science Foundation Civic Innovation Program. And then the one on the right is an experience that my students and I have actually gone through with a resident activist group called the Friends of Evans Spring, who are fighting to preserve one of the last remaining urban forests, which happens to be located in an African-American community that is also one of the hottest in the city, areas of the city.
As Theo had mentioned, this is our program. It's the Hope for Heat for Resilience. HOPE stands for Healing Our People with Empathy. The long technical name is Youth-Centered Civic Technology, Science, and Art for Community Heat Resilience. Our project is a project that is funded by the National Science Foundation Civic Innovation Challenge. We are one of 19 teams that have been selected. They say teams, I would more likely say communities, that have been selected and provided a $1 million grant to do this project. It is the hope of NSF that we will be able to flip the traditional research and development model or concept, and by doing so, be able to implement a more community-led research and question-defined community-led research with questions that are defined by the community, not by others. Now, Theo has presented this to me as the urban or the typical urban planning process. And within this process, when he first introduced it, I noticed the first thing was, oh, look at number 4. Number 1 speaks and talks about issues are being defined by the planning department. And then it takes you all the way till number 4, where you begin to seek the input of your community. And I would say to anyone, if you are waiting until you get to step number 4 to seek the input of your community, you are already behind. Your project may already have holes in it or may have barriers to it. But if you're waiting to communicate with your community way further on down in the process after you've already done the decision making, then more than likely you're going to meet some form of opposition. And if you haven't done the internal work that you need to have done, then that opposition will be what leads to the demise of your project and your planning. So
through continued engagement with the community, what we have here is the model that we're trying to implement, which is not only planning from the bottom up from a grassroots perspective, but planning that starts with youth engagement. So we're really trying to break down these assumed hierarchies and roles between researcher and community member, planner or expert and resident, and even adults and children. We start by broadening our approach to including activities that are arts activities and spirituality programs where kids are doing using arts to define what resilience means to them or what their relationship is to urban nature. We've got youth doing place-based environmental science programs. All of those create artifacts that are then used by 8 high school students that we've recruited who are being trained in some of the technical skills of urban planning. And there's a lot of cross-learning there between my graduate students at Virginia Tech and them, and they're learning actually in both directions from each other. And then creating plans for using the artifacts that come from those arts and spirituality programs and science programs to create neighborhood plans to increase resilience of their own community. And then those plans would be adopted by the city.
One of the main focuses on our program is to recognize the work that is already being done in our community. There's already work that's being done that we would consider resilience hub work. And one of the main focuses for our project is really to help with the capacity and expanding the capacity of those organizations. Right here you see on the left-hand side, Ms. Darlene, who actually runs the Hope Center. The Hope Center has been in our community for over nine years, providing free lunches, boxes for family, clothing, and other services. And on the right-hand side, you see actually some of our students, the students that we are working with, the 8 high school students that we are working with and training to be urban planning or training them on urban planning concepts, but they consider themselves community planners. Also, what we've realized is that in order to make change, what we have to do is do some cultural changes. We've implemented mindfulness moments and times for reflection and opportunities for people to do internal work throughout the planning process. One of the main things that we really wanted to do was to break down the silos that are in our community. We have silos that are within our government. We have silos that have been erected within our nonprofit organizations, and even our neighborhood groups and neighborhood associations have built silos around themselves. So one of the main efforts that we wanted to do was introduce them to concepts that would help them break down those silos and then start to form new partnerships that can change our community and also that can change where we're going and where our community is going in the future. Ways that we'd like to respond are through arts and spirituality. We realize that arts and spirituality helps to broaden the perception or the participation of our children so that they can have a chance to tell their story. Often we find that the younger individuals don't have an opportunity to have their voices be heard. And we wanted to present them a chance through presenting their artifacts. And right here in the pictures, you can see some of their artifacts that they have. And on the left-hand side, even one child placed a fan. All she's looking for is a fan because in her house, that fan would make a difference. We've also taken time to make sure that we're vigilant about re-traumatization and discussing intergenerational organizing. On the left-hand side, you actually see the structures that were created from urban renewal. So when I spoke about the 1,600 homes and the churches that were removed, it was all done to create this highway, which is known as 581. And not only that, it was all done to create what we call our civic center in our area. On the right-hand side, you have one of our young historians. His name is Jordan Bell in our community. He's actually taking our 8 high school students as well as Theo's students on what we call a history walk. And he's walking them through our community where they have a chance to see the actual locations where buildings once stood, where they once used to be. Right across from the place that you see right here used to be a 25-bedroom mansion that was owned by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Clater in the Roanoke Valley area, who was one of the only African-American doctors that were allowed to practice in Southwest Virginia at that time. Within our classroom structure and even within the work that we're doing with the community, we may be introducing some hard and tough conversations about urban renewal and the impact on our community, but we like to also encourage our community by showing them, by giving them the tools and giving them the resources that they need so that they know that, yes, urban renewal has happened, but we're looking to you. We're looking to the future for change. Right here, we have a picture of Kula Messina. Kula Messina's birth name is Antonio Stovall, but he is also one of the instructors of our 8 high school students. He actually helps by presenting what is community circles, where individuals can talk. And he passes around this wand or this stick, and you can only speak when it's in your presence. But he does this in a way of healing. He does it in a way where we do meditation, where we may do songs. And even here on the side, you will actually see one of the speeches that he did during our community circle. All of this is done to promote confidence in the young people in our community and to help improve our community's direction.
So just a quick summary of this part. I think this quote from one of the members of our leadership team, actually Miss Darlene, said that heat resilience is the name, but it ain't the game. And by that, what we mean is that what the community is asking for is capacity in general. And so what our work is doing is, yes, the topic is heat. It happens to be heat, but we hope that the tools that are being developed are transferable to any other disruption that the community might face. So some things that we're hoping are happening, recognizing the work of community centers that are already functioning as resilience hubs, an assets-based approach. The cultural changes, mindfulness, time for reflection, and internal work that are helping break down some of those silos. Arts and spirituality that broaden participation and giving the community a chance to define what resilience means for itself. Opportunities for intergenerational organizing, and then lastly, promoting of confidence of the young people to improve their own community. Okay, I'd like to move on to our second example here. Which is a collaborative planning exercise that my students and I went through with a resident activist group called the Friends of Evans Spring. As I mentioned, Evans Spring is this little blue oasis in kind of the sea of red that is the predominantly African-American community that we've just been talking about. It's approximately 150 acres, and much of it is forested, and in 2020 plans to develop the Evans Spring area, which consists of several privately owned parcels, were reignited. These plans called for intensive commercial and residential development, which triggered significant backlash from the surrounding African-American community. And the Friends of Evans Spring, which we call FOES, is the most prominent resident group that kind of emerged to organize efforts to resist the development of this area. So I was aware that the Friends of Evans Spring were up against some real challenges in their goal to preserve that area completely from development as a nature park, because the parcels are privately owned and the city was not keen on acquiring the parcels to establish a park. However, I volunteered to use my graduate course, which is called Collaborative Planning and Community Engagement, to help the group. From the beginning, it was not clear what the graduate class could contribute to FOES, but it was clear that a trauma-informed and healing-centered approach was necessary in order to sensitively engage with the members of FOES. We knew that trauma is present in the daily lives of the residents in this area because of the high levels of poverty and associated challenges, which we've heard about. We also acknowledge that these issues are inextricably linked to urban planning institutions that have contributed to spatial segregation by race and class, such as urban renewal, which has caused intergenerational community-level trauma. So over the 15 weeks of the semester, we all found ourselves changed by this process of deep community engagement. In short, if this process of deep community engagement that we went through with the Friends of Evans Spring could change us as complete strangers and outsiders to this community, we thought that this might point to a path forward for cultural change for the institutions of planning as well, through the adopting of principles of trauma-informed and healing-centered planning. In 2022, the City Council voted to hire an external consultant to produce a plan for the Evans Spring area. Part of that plan was supposed to include community engagement. The consultant then proceeded to use community engagement to come up with a list of non-negotiables. They assumed that if their design avoided these non-negotiables, then the community would have to be satisfied with the resulting plan, which in the end included an expanded highway interchange, big box stores, and market rate housing, which doesn't sound dissimilar actually from urban renewal. And they claimed that it would be good for the neighborhood because it would bring economic development. However, many residents of Northwest were dissatisfied with the type of community engagement that was conducted. They referred to the engagement as false choices and manufactured consent, and they were angry, and the disagreement became very public. So our approach was to view the planning process as one of storytelling. My students came into the issue of Evans Spring with a lot of anxiety, knowing that it is charged and controversial, and they were constantly wondering what their role could be as outsiders. But they stepped back and they asked, what is the underlying problem that we are trying to address? We ran listening circles. We wrote fill-in-the-blank stories, envisioning the past and future of the Evans Spring area. We ran fishbowl sessions where members of the Friends of Evans Spring could communicate their emotions that were emerging both from processing the past and from visioning various scenarios for the future. And through this, the students really learned the story of Northwest, a different story than they had previously heard. They learned that despite Northwest's reputation as crime-ridden and violent, there's also this deep sense of pride and a strong culture of mutual aid that is under-recognized. And we learned that Evans Spring represented freedom, youth, independence to the residents. They had beautiful memories of riding their bikes, eating fruit from the trees in that area, and playing in the swimming hole. The vision for Evans Spring is connected to the residents' past experiences of nature and the city, and the motivation surrounding Evans Spring today is connected with the betrayal the residents felt associated with urban renewal. At the end of this exercise, we felt we were beginning to understand more of what the problem was. It included feeling devalued, ignored, and disrespected by the city's officials who they felt should be representing them. I'll also not dwell on these too long, but the members of FOES who participated in our workshops also reported outcomes that we might associate with healing, including feelings of trust, feeling listened to for the first time, strengthened social supports with each other inside of their group, and having created a coherent narrative and understanding how the past is connected to the goals of their group. What I do want to focus on is how we, my students and I, were changed to the process of trauma-informed and healing-centered planning. As I mentioned, we experienced a lot of uncertainty and anxiety about what to do throughout the semester. There were many conflicting facts and interpretations of truth that emerged that all seemed plausible. The students, they both empathized with the stories from the city planners and their explanations to have to balance multiple interests and difficult trade-offs. And at the same time, they were hearing the residents' deeply emotional stories of the loss and pain and grief of urban renewal, the destruction of their community, and feeling ignored. Amongst the uncertainty and anxiety that we experienced, what many of us took away was, instead of trying to evaluate the truth of the situation, which is an intellectual exercise, it was actually more important for us to actuate how to be from a place of neighborly love. I was so moved, actually, when one of my students, who's just 22 years old, came to me with this quotation from C.S. Lewis, the theologian, as a way he thought could help us find a path forward. It says, "The rule for us is perfectly simple. Do not waste time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did. As soon as we do this, we find one of the greatest secrets. When you are behaving as if you loved someone, you will presently come to love him." We experienced a conscious reorientation toward emotions and values. This reorientation was caused by a recognition of the limitations of intellectual understanding. Intellectually, we understand that the development of Evans Spring, including allowing for upzoning, is not the same as the uncompensated and illegal takings of private properties of African Americans during urban renewal in Roanoke. But our approach of trauma-informed and healing-centered engagement also allowed us to completely understand how the Evans Spring development was triggering the trauma of the city's betrayal, devaluing, and disrespect of its African American residents. And we learned to recognize the affective meaning behind the phrase urban renewal 2.0 applied to Evans Spring. The process of deeply relating to people, to be vulnerable in the fact that we actually had no idea if we could really make any difference, and yet be willing to listen and to hold another's pain and hope, made us deeply reflect on what the role of community engagement should be. At the final presentation that my students made back to the Friends of Evans Spring, they used Patricia Wilson's 10 Principles for Community Engagement to illustrate how they understood action in the context of working in a trauma-informed and healing-centered way. And I won't read all of this, but core to all of these principles is practicing empathy and humility. In our final presentation back to the Friends of Evans Spring, my students presented the Friends of Evans Spring story back to them in the form of this letter. They wrote, "Dear Friends of Evans Spring, your story is one of strength, endurance, and love. It has a deep history from the vibrant and colorful life of Henry Street, the pain of betrayal, destruction, and invisibility, to the neighbors of Northwest who plant gardens, care for and mentor children, and honor their elders, provide moments of beauty, art, and rest. You are already cultivating leadership in exactly the ways of your heroes of the civil rights era. You have sacrificed your time, and your passion is courageous. We cannot predict how the struggle for Evans Spring will end, but we do know you will persevere. In times of challenge and controversy, as you look at the long road ahead, remember how far you have come. We hope that our story, our brief overlap in paths, will remind you it is possible to do planning in a different way, in a way in which all parties grow and learn together. It is our sincere hope that in our small way, we have modeled that this is possible. We see you and we thank you for the opportunity." At the end of my students' final presentation to the Friends of Evans Spring, many of us from Virginia Tech and from the Friends of Evans Spring were in tears. In our final debrief, the Friends of Evans Spring requested that we make the same presentation, demonstrating the power of trauma-informed and healing-centered community engagement, to Roanoke City Council. Imagine, they wanted us to say, if the point of planning is to generate opportunities to heal, if the point of planning is to generate opportunities to become neighbors and exhibit neighborly love. They wanted me to present Patricia Wilson's 10 principles to City Council as guidelines for all future community engagement to promote rebuilding of trust and healing. And they thought it could be transformative for the culture of how government has related to the residents in the city of Roanoke, just as it was transformative for us. So that presentation to City Council did happen just a few weeks ago. And unfortunately, I cannot report that it was a total success, as these kinds of things are usually not. But there were echoes that our message was heard. And I highlight this here in a quotation by the vice mayor in their deliberations after our presentation, where he acknowledged that the point of the Evans Spring debate was to do the work of conversations that would promote healing, and that the trauma that hasn't been addressed needs to be addressed. So in conclusion here, our presentation had kind of two halves that correspond with the two halves of our definition of trauma-informed and healing-centered planning. First, that the healing effects that the act of emotionally and culturally responsive planning can have with the groups that have experienced collective trauma. And then secondly, the actions that are needed to transform the institutions of planning to stop these systems of harm and to make amends for these past harms, which for us meant recognizing transformation of ourselves and how we learn to be and to see. So we want to also acknowledge that we have a big leadership team as part of our HOPE project, you can see here.
Right here on the left-hand side, you see a picture of Roanoke in 2008. On the right side, you see a picture of Roanoke in 2018. If you look, most of the buildings are the same. Most of the highways and streets that you see will be the same. And there is no change. But if there is change, where does that begin then? Where is the change at? The change is in here. The change is within our high school students. The change is within the students that are in elementary school and those that are about to start preschool in years from now. They will be the change of our community. They will be the ones that will lead to the change that happens in our community. Kula Messina says that in order for us to continue to move, there are some things we have to do. And really, it's about the internal process and internal work that we do. Often we know why planners or individuals may be in a meeting, but sometimes you don't know the history of the community advocate or the person that may be your opposition or the one that may actually could be your greatest collaborator in the work that you do. So hopefully within our presentation, there are some glimpses to what a community advocate can do for you and the story behind an advocate. And I asked you, if you ever forget, remember the picture of the dump. I used to see the dump as a green, grassy hill, a place to play. But then I had to realize that in all honesty, for most people in my community, and even through some of the things that I had to endure, it's always been a dump. And if you go into someone's community and you have an opportunity to work with them, sometimes you can't see through your eyes. You might have to change your lens, change your focus. And if you can't do that, then look through 4-year-old Antwyne's eyes and don't look out there as a grassy green hill where hot air balloons land. Look out there and see what it really truly is. For some, it may truly still be a dump. And the only way we can take care of this and the only way we can change our communities and those we work for is like what Baba Kula Messina says to us often. The only way out is in.
My back started hurting me.
Go back. You want to sit down? Okay, so we'd be happy to take any questions from the audience, if there are any.
Straight.
Yes, in the back there. Yep. I couldn't quite hear, but was the question how we came together? Okay.
Well, I can. in my community, I'm always searching for individuals that are what we call light workers. The individuals that want to come in our community, do work, but don't necessarily want to come in and try to influence us and believe that they already, as we've seen the planning principles, sometimes planners might come to our community already with a perception or ideas. So when I met Theo many seasons ago at a group, my first thought was, I don't think I want to hear about trees. Yeah, I understand it's about heat, but if all we're talking about is planting trees or increasing tree canopy, then I'm gonna have to pass on this. So even when Theo was talking about the point where he met me at my office, I was done. I had already been to his meetings. I had already been around. And if you're about to plant 10 trees on the street where individuals operate and live in survival mode, I didn't think that was going to help my community. I understand that there is a heat issue in my community, but there's also individuals that operate from survival mode. How do we address those things collectively? And it was when Theo knocked on my door and we stood out there and I started to help talk to him about what I saw in my community. That's where I realized for myself that he really was coming to do some real work, that he was really willing to even go back and scrap everything that he had as the project in the beginning and then start to pivot and change that plan. And that's where I think we began to work together. And even we had a conversation about this earlier, similar to this.
Yeah, I think, partially what we're actually asking very similar questions. So the research that goes into the Hope Project is actually all about organizational learning. How do you strengthen community networks of people and have people learn from each other, social learning, and all that? And Antwyne doesn't use the same language, but he's actually also very interested in those same things. His experiences have put him at multiple levels in his community where he's been on the ground, he's been in the city, he's been at multiple nonprofits, and he sees what are the connections between these different organizations. And so we were just reflecting on this earlier. Why is it that we, could make this work? I think it's because we're actually asking very similar questions about how to what was the word you used? Knowledge, implementation, and yes, manifestation. So that's his terminology. But for me, it's about the knowledge action interface or things like that. So actually very similar interests. Yeah. Yeah, Tice. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe I'll jump back to this photo just to help you imagine. This is one of our all hands meetings. So we've got like 25 different organizations represented at these, and we have these at set intervals. At each of these all hands meetings, we actually do a repeated measures questionnaire where we're asking people to tell us what they think resilience means, tell us what they think the question that we're trying to address is, and then we see how that changes over time. And we've got this quadrant, right, where you might imagine organizational complexity on the y-axis and then problem complexity on the x-axis. And some people, define the problem very narrowly, and they're like, what we need to do is plant trees. And so they're like here at the bottom, like near the origin. And some people are like, this is a problem of poverty and racism, which is like all the way at the other, wicked problem end, right? But what's interesting is the shifts that go back and forth along those axes, and that's what we're trying to track. and seeing whether the formation of new partnerships can help people feel more efficacy towards a problem, or in some cases maybe less in the middle. But like that's what we're trying to measure over time. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so we don't have the full results yet because this is going until October, but that's what I'm waiting to see too. We've seen some preliminary interesting shifts of like, the Kiwanis Club is defining this in this way, and they came into our planning process thinking it was about this, but now they're starting to talk about trauma because we're integrating trauma and healing into our all hands meetings as like another frame, which is interesting.
And I'd like to just add from my perspective, a lot of the work is internal. So some of the things that we're asking individuals to do is actually changing how they normally would work with other individuals who are in the room or people who are in the community, where they actually have to take that mirror and start looking at themselves instead of always saying that person or this organization is not doing this, or this is the problem. Well, now sometimes you have to turn that mirror on yourself and ask yourself, have you really dealt with some of the issues that you have internally, to make sure that when you show up in the community, that you show up in the community in the right way, that you're not there actually helping to make an issue worse, that you're not bringing your trauma to an area that already is actively experiencing trauma, and then next thing you know, you basically set that on a 10 or on its highest level. Well, if you're doing the internal work, and that's what we're asking some of our community members and even our students and ourselves, is assess yourself, look at yourself, ask yourself, is this ego? Where's your path, and what are you doing, and why are you doing this? And that's where I think, that Theo may do his white paper and I'll still be in the community, but I can see my community leaders are changing. I can see their way that they approach even working with each other, collaborating with each other, that there's a change. And even as you described the Hope Center, we're already seeing a major significant change in what her confidence level is in her organization's ability to continue to move forward. That is a major thing. She even knows how to now describe her organization in a way that she is very confident when she sits in front of a funding source or someone that asks her, what is the work that you can do? Because we've helped her create the resources that she needs that can tell her story in multiple ways. That is something that will propel this organization to a higher level. And even she's getting a 501c3 status, and all of these other things are being taken care of right now as we speak. This organization's capacity will be changed for years moving forward.
I should say that Miss Darlene currently funds all of this work at the Hope Center through her own donations. So she, through the process of working with us and others, she kind of is, really pushing herself.
She's open. Yeah. She's one thing I can say is that she's completely open to the process. And some organizations and some places, they don't open themselves up to change. And she's been open up to the change, and because of that, you can see that it has been beneficial to her.
Maybe one more question, if there's one. If not, then thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah.